Good morning. My name is Paul Floranges. I am a board member of the Digital Signage Federation, and on behalf of Sony Electronics, I'd like to welcome you to our panel this morning, Inspiring Change and Fostering Belonging, How Inclusive Leadership Can Guide the Future of the Tech Industry. We all know that tech companies, large and small, are recognizing the need for equitable change and creating a greater sense of belonging and inclusivity, leading to greater diversity in the workforce, leadership, and marketplace. But how do companies bridge the knowing and get to the doing? Joining me is a panel of esteemed guests from throughout the tech industry to discuss, raise awareness to, and advocate for enduring change that favorably impacts the entire spectrum of human diversity in the tech industry. Our panel this morning, Tammy Fuqua, who is an AV professional with 20 years experience working with manufacturers and their partners to develop and cultivate relationships. In addition, she is also co-chair of the Avixa Women's Council. Next to Tammy is Terrence Boyd, who is the Senior Business and Commercialization Manager of the Pro Projection category in Sony's Pro B2B division. Say that 3 times fast. In his 15th year, his background includes product marketing, business planning, and as a lead for many project management initiatives. He's also a volunteer member of Sony's Diversity and Sustainability Office, where he is helping to drive the execution of Sony's DEI roadmap. Frank Paticala, next to Terrence, is a technology architect and AV design engineer who places innovation and inclusion at the heart of his design philosophy. He volunteers with Avixa and is currently serving as the chair of the Avixa Diversity Council, where he is constantly mentoring and creating opportunities for community development through open communication. And last but not least, Jen Steinhardt. Jen is an AV design consultant for Shen, Wilson, and Wilk, but you may know her at Nerdy Girl AV in the Twitterverse. She has been in the AV industry for over 5 years, and her background in DEI advocacy stems from her undergraduate in media arts and design and graduate degree in sociology. So that's our panel for this morning. So let's jump right in, folks. As I said in the beginning, this has been a topic that's been talked about in the tech industry a lot lately. I'm wondering what you guys think is driving that conversation. Tammy, we'll start with you because you are next to me.
Okay, no pressure starting first. Yeah, I think those conversations are so important because I'm going to take the stance of being a woman in this industry and only having 14% women. There is a need for diversity in the AV industry. Being in it 20 years, I've seen a lot of change, but there's a lot I still need to see. So I think that that's why the Avixa Women's Council is so important, so that these women can come together and have a group that they can network with and feel safe and be able to talk about their experiences in regards to diversity.
Terrence?
I think representation in the technology industry and seeing diverse people coming into the industry is something that is really advantageous. It's advantageous to not only our workforces, but also the products and services that we deliver to make sure that we're reflecting and accurate and being relevant to our customer base and to our people that we work with. So I think that it's very I don't want to say timely. It's something that we've been looking at for a long time, and I think that there's a lot of momentum now to really continue that exploration of diversifying our workforces and our offerings to our customers.
So, Frank, being that you sit on the Avixa Diversity Council, from your perspective, are you hearing that more, or is this a message that's being pushed down, do you think, from organizations like Avixa or other trade organizations?
I think it's a combination of a whole lot of factors. It starts off with the understanding that there is a need for diversity and inclusion in our industry. And there's tons of stats and lots of great information that provides a backup for that. And the key fact is we are at our core a tech industry. And the whole purpose of tech is bridging these gaps. And as a tech industry, we should be at the forefront of this, and diversity is a part of this conversation. So I think it's a combination of a lot of great visionary leaders who understand that there is a diversity challenge that our industry is facing, and just going about how to solve those things.
Jen?
I would say absolutely what Frank said. I can say as someone from my neurodiversity background and my background with mood disorders as well, is what we want to be doing is this diversity initiative is about creating a better workplace for our colleagues and for our customers. And when we are embracing this, looking at how can I support you and what do you need and how do you feel welcomed, to be worrying less about how you are feeling in these situations and doing your best work.
But DEI takes on different meanings, different initiatives across different companies and different verticals within those companies, large and small. So, what does it take to get an initiative like this going? Is it alignment top to bottom, sideways, up? Frank, I'll let you go.
I think the most important thing there is that the understanding there is no one solution that fits everyone. Diversity in itself is diverse. The beauty of diversity is that there are new challenges coming up every day. So it is a constant journey of not just implementing things, it's also about learning on that journey. So being diverse within diversity initiatives is kind of critical. So it's about growing. It's a journey.
Jen, you mentioned neurodiversity, and you and I were talking offline about this. A lot of times I think people focus, when they talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, on race and sex, gender. What about those people who are neurodiverse, or those people who might be mobility impaired? Are we thinking about that when we talk about DEI?
Absolutely. We're talking about, so there's a concept called intersectionality, and that is the idea that there are many different components of your identity that make up your diversity, right? So when you look at me, you might see, well, there's a maybe gender non-conforming female, but a lot of my diversity you wouldn't know unless I disclosed it. So that's an invisible diversity. But your invisible diversities, your physical diversities, your cultural diversities, these are all diversities of thoughts. And it all contributes to how you think and the ideas that you generate, how you collaborate, and the accommodations that you need to get work done. And so neurotypical people, people who are not neurodiverse, they don't have ADHD or autism or mood disorders, they also have diversities of their own and their own ways of thinking. So the idea is that there's no bad way, there's just different ways of accomplishing these tasks and working
But
together.
Terrence, how do corporations get their head around all of this? Because it's not just as simple as back in the 60s, 70s, we were talking about affirmative action, right? Or we were talking about, getting more people of color into the workforce or more women in leadership positions. What Jen's talking about is a full, and what we're trying to get at here is a full spectrum of diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do corporations get their hands around that? You're involved in Sony's work.
I think it starts with conversations like this where we're having and talking with in earnest, as we explore the topic of diversity, in all areas of our workplace and as it affects us. I think it's important that we're able to have these type of conversations, and also we have to understand that they're going to lead us into some uncomfortable places of those conversations. But until we kind of broach the subject, until we kind of start to listen to and hear the different perspectives, the diverse perspectives that we have, and until we start to reflect that upward, up through our leadership structure, then I think businesses will be able to take this on at a deeper level. It'll accelerate faster as we start to see these thoughts and have these discussions at higher and higher levels as it becomes ingrained in our culture of discussion. So I think it kind of really starts there with just learning how to talk with each other like we're doing right here.
But a lot of times, Sam, you see companies start DEI programs, they start DEI initiatives with the best interest in mind, right? Their heart's in the right place, their mind might be in the right place, but it just doesn't work out. And when it doesn't work out, people kind of get deflated. How do you handle that?
Well, I think everything starts with a lot of education. And if a program isn't working, then maybe it's time to change it to something new that will maybe actually catch people that you didn't catch on the first round. But I find that having the conversations like we're talking about, the education amongst not only the executives, but everyone top down in a company, so that there's an understanding that certain language isn't allowed, or maybe it's a little dated, or just allowing those conversations to happen, I think, are the most vital part of it.
Mm-hmm. But do you find that executives of a certain age group or a certain sex have a hard time with these conversations?
I think they do, but they're needed. I think that no matter what gender you are, what age you are, you still have to realize that there's a whole generation that's coming up into these workforces that are not going to stand for those types of those biases anymore. So it either changes or they're not going to be able to keep a workforce in their company.
But Frank, that's like an intergenerational thing. How does that influence how companies should look at their DEI models? Because what Tammy's talking about, I mean, I have kids in their 30s. They come from a different perspective. How do you factor that into how you develop a DEI program to deal with the core issue, but then also deal with this generational issue with, younger kids? And I'm not going to give them the social demographic term, but how do you deal with that piece of it?
It's important that we stop making assumptions. That is the start of every single diversity journey there is. And assumptions are when we try to think on behalf of a particular demographic, race, group, or whatever. So it's important that we gather information. It's a learning journey. I don't like to say that it's something that you can one and done. It's constantly evolving. And to Jen's point, intersectionality is at its core the biggest element that a lot of people and organizations overlook when they're trying to design these DEI initiatives, because it's easy to put people into boxes. We are a tech industry, and being tech and science driven, we try to filter based on certain criteria. But people are more complex than that. So give yourself room for error all the time, as with any good statistics, and learn and evolve and kind of adapt to changes. Be open to feedback and understand that people are very complex beings. That, at its core, would help us design constantly evolving DEI initiatives that are acceptable to the ever-changing demographic that we're doing.
But everyone knows that there is unconscious bias, right?
Oh,
And that can influence recruitment and hiring process. So Jen, what more can be done to remove those unconscious bias effects that people face, both just by looking at us, but then as you talked about, the invisible piece of it?
Right. By nature, we are all biased in one way or another, whether we like to admit it or not. Social change is a very slow and complicated process. I agree with Frank said. People are very complicated, for better or worse. But by being aware of making it a focused effort for your leadership to be looking at, what are other individuals that are not like me going through, and what can we do to look at our processes? What does our hiring process look like? Where are we recruiting from? And also, once they come on board, then what are we doing for them as well? And in that onboarding process, a lot of conversations like, what are your preferred pronouns? Do you have a preferred name? How do you do your best work? Do you prefer having deadlines and tasks be provided to you by written formats? Or do you prefer going through in calls and having that dialogue? It can seem very daunting and complicated because you have an entire organization. But from a sociological perspective, those social changes are through those micro moments, and it takes an entire cultural shift to really be dedicated to make that move forward.
What are then, we talk about data transparency when it comes to our phones and tracking us on advertising. How important is data transparency and the sharing of related diversity metrics as you're building the program, as you're rolling it out, and then as you're presenting it to your stakeholders? I'll start with you, Tam.
I think it is important to have some transparency, but I would say that to the points of keeping all of this grounded, and you want to be able to have respect for the person that's coming into the company. I think that the transparency with the company needs to be forefront, and being able to communicate that with everyone.
So what do you think the metrics of success are then, Terrence?
In terms of transparency?
In terms of either transparency, data, or just in general the DEI program. What are metrics of success that people watching this, people listening here, people thinking about it should start to focus on as they start to build it, right? Because you have to figure out what your metrics are and where you want to land, right? And you can't judge yourself until you set up, some metrics.
Sure. I mean, so I'm kind of taking this from the female perspective on growing in a company. The way that I would measure some of those successes is like, do you have women in the executive positions in your company? There's a lot of times where I'm in a company and maybe I only see females at a certain level and they're not getting up to those higher positions. I'd say that's a measure of seeing success in a company with diversity, seeing more diversity roles up in the executive positions. Recently, I had some people asking me, when I'm hiring, I only get men that are applying for the positions, and I'm telling them, well, maybe it's the way that you're sending those job positions out into, when you're looking for recruitment. If you're not putting the right recruitment together, then maybe you're not going to draw the right candidates. And so it's in that wording and language and how you're going to be able to measure the success of getting the right candidates in too.
Frank, I see you nodding.
Yes, I wanted to kind of speak up on this as well. So metrics is a very interesting term, and I am fundamentally...
Is it the right term? Is it the right term, or is it not the right
No,
term?
I will be
Talking about
honest, I
DEI.
do not think it's the right term. And the reason why I say that is that we live in a metrics-driven world. Everything is driven by metrics. There's sales quotas, there's percentages that we associate. The challenge with diversity, though, is that the metrics or the success rate that we see are not always tangible. And it's not something that you can say, oh, right, I have achieved this particular goal, right? It cannot be based on numbers. It is about being in tandem with what the society is looking at. And that's if our intentions are rooted in the cause as opposed to numbers, I feel that the DEI initiatives can be more successful. And to Tammy's point, which is excellent, particularly about recruitment, sometimes we need to be intentional about it. Metrics means that we have checked boxes. That's the thing about metrics. So we're saying that, all right, metrics told me that I'm lacking in certain diversities. Let's do X, Y, Z. But we've just checked boxes there. We have to take it intentional. And that is where, when you're trying to hire, when you're trying to promote yourself as an organization that is looking forward to build a diverse population within the organization, it's about being intentional. How can you do that? Be more specific. Say that we are an organization that supports this. So as a quick example, I've had people from recruiters from several organizations reach out to me and say, Frank, you're the chair of the Diversity Council. Can you promote this particular role within our organization? And I say, absolutely. Now, you got to understand that when a recruiter is contacting me, it's not like they haven't already put this out through your LinkedIns and your very common places. But to Tammy's point, a lot of people would not apply for those because there is bias. There's a thought process that says, well, that organization doesn't necessarily look or feel like somewhere where I'd be welcome. That's where you got to be reaching out to the demographic that you're looking for. So that means contacting them, telling them. And as an example, right, if you're trying to hire more women, the question is, yes, it's a great cause. I appreciate you. Wonderful. But what have you built into your ecosystem that supports this? Because women, again, are diverse. There's 1,000 diversities, and I'm just putting a number there, within that term women, right? What do you have in terms of resources? What kind of affinity groups do you have? What kind of support do you provide to working mothers? If you're pregnant, if you're breastfeeding, what does your organization do there? So it's a lot of initiatives that needs to come with the intentional cause that you're trying to build. So I don't know if metrics is the right word. I understand why we use that, but at the same time, it's not just about checking boxes. It's about being intentional about what your cause is.
If I may?
Yes, please.
There's a great example from HBR Review. They have an interview with, I forget her name at the moment, but she's a leadership in DEI for P&G. And the way that they use metrics is that they're looking at, again, very intentional inclusion metrics, because any metrics we know is only as good as the study. You know, what are we putting into that to get good data? But what they do is not only are they looking at, okay, who's coming into the data pool or into our hiring pool, and then also what's happening while they're there. Where are they going? Are they leaving? And something that they found by using these metrics is they were doing great with getting people of color in, but they were leaving. they weren't staying, they weren't getting growth into the companies, and so they realized, okay, now we need to go back and look, why are they leaving? What can we do to provide? And some of the examples that Frank gave are excellent examples of here's what we need to be doing with that data, not just collecting it and doing tallies.
So to that, Terrence, I'm going to ask you this. How influential do you believe pre-career role models, opportunities for internships, and other factors are in shaping the direction of people that Jen's talking about, who you're pulling into the pool, but instead of coming into the deep end, they go to the shallow end and get out of the pool and leave?
Yeah, I think it's you have to have some. I think there's a lot of young folks who are looking for role models. They're looking for from a representative standpoint, they're looking to see who is in the industry. They're looking to follow. They're looking to emulate. And when you don't have figures that align with or harmonize with your personal situation or your type of diversity, and you don't see that in the companies that you're looking for, it doesn't paint an optimistic picture for you in terms of the culture that you might be going into. So I think that as companies start to broaden their horizons from a diversity perspective, then I think that people coming into the tech industry will have more role models to really look at and to not necessarily idolize, but I mean, there's a path to follow, and it makes me feel like, oh, I have an opportunity to, from a sense of belonging, to really fit into this organization. So I do think that, when you have people from diverse backgrounds, I think it takes an active part even on our parts to really reach out and talk to young talent as they're coming into the industry, to let them know that you can be also a part of changing the conversation with what the diversity landscape looks like within the tech industry. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and so with that, I mean, as far as finding role models and mentors, I mean, that was part of the reason why I joined the Avixa Women's Council to begin with, because I didn't have those role models coming up in the industry when I first started. And then as soon as I found the council, I was able to find like-minded women that wanted to empower each other as we wanted to affect the change that we wanted to see in the industry. So I think to your point, it's very important to find those role models, because they're the ones that are going to help you grow. I mean, I could honestly say that without the relationships that I found in the Avixa Women's Council, I would not be where I am today in my career. And I think that also translates that you want to find companies that are the same type of like-minded organizations that you are now finding role models with.
So we've all lived through the pandemic. We're still kind of living in it. We've seen the great resignation. And now you hear the World Bank Organization, other economists talking about the great stagflation that's coming. On top of that, you've got work from home. We're talking about pushing down a change in culture within organizations. How do you do that when you have hybrid work, remote work? How does that happen? Jen, I'm going to start with you, and we're going to come down the row. I want to hear everybody's take on this one.
Great. Make the autistic one go first.
Oh, come on.
So how do we make that happen? It goes back to that conversation again of how can I support you? What kind of factors are best to help you work, for example? Do you have ADHD? Perhaps working in an open work environment may not be the best for you. Everybody works in different ways, so just because you have one certain diversity does not mean, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about neurodiversity, racial, cultural, or other, how these identities affect you, how you think, how you work is different for everyone. So start having those conversations. Be intentional about the spaces that you're doing, the technologies that you're providing to people.
Frank?
I want to take this back to the one buzzword that we've been using from the beginning of this meeting. We say DEI. And diversity, we spoke a little bit about it, but the E and the I stand for equity and inclusion, right? If there's anything that the hybrid remote era has taught us, is that there are several ways that you can achieve equity and inclusion within an organization. Although the pandemic did kind of force everyone's hand and cause this thing to become a thing that now employers have to look into, we got to kind of dial it back and think, what was really the reason? Why do people want to do this? And I think it's about empowerment. Tammy touched on that, right? When we talk about role models, when we look up to people, at every individual's core, they want to feel empowered in their jobs, in their lives, over themselves. And that's where neurodiversities, your background, all the different intersectionalities come together to create that unique you, that individual that we're all trying to be. So when we're trying to build that journey, which includes people, which is conscious about the different challenges that every individual face, organizations now need to realize that people want to feel empowered. So it's about creating an environment where we are, again, I'm going to use this several times during this conversation, being intentional. It's about understanding that I now have a workforce that wants to be hybrid, that wants to work remote. How can I best create an environment where there's equity between everyone? And again, it boils down to the simple fact of communication. It's about reaching out and it's about understanding individual challenges. And that is where I feel management, your leadership has a very important role by being transparent and going back to the whole data transparency conversation. When we have data on what is working and what is not working, it's also about being transparent with the participants in the data and telling them, this is what we are using the data for, and we are building this for you based on the data that we have. If you would like to affect change, please speak up. And now there comes an additional challenge where speaking up, as easy as it may sound, is not easy for a lot of people. So it's about building a comfortable, non-combative workplace where people have the ability to speak up and say, this is what I like, this is what I don't like. And that back and forth communication can go a long way in building that new generation of workplace that we think will ideally be working for everyone.
Terrence, I see you nodding in agreement, but you also
Yeah,
work at a huge company in Sony. How do you make that happen? You're on the DEI workforce.
So I want to talk about the empowerment piece that Frank was talking about. I think as we're seeing people coming back into workplaces, into the hybrid type situations, I think the empowerment piece is important because the redistribution of equity that we want to talk about is as we start to work remote, as we start to work within our own space, that balance of equity, that power of equity is shifting back to us because what we're finding is a lot of us are not impacted by these negative factors that may have contributed to our lack of whether it be different resources, trajectory, whatever, in our careers. We are working within our spaces, and because we're working in our spaces, we are able to self-care for our own needs. And motivations, and so whether it be family or professional or whatever those needs are, we're able to accommodate and take care of those needs more. So I think that by working away from the office location, we're finding ourselves being more empowered. We're finding ourselves being more empowered to take on and to do what we need to do. And companies that trust in our abilities to do that at home, wherever you're working, I don't care if it's from the beach or wherever, it doesn't matter. But companies trust in our abilities and capabilities to do the work. And when companies do that, that's where we start to feel included. That's where we start to feel listened to because they're now not focused on the other minutia that doesn't necessarily determine my capability output. And I think that's been very refreshing. And with the great resignation that you were talking about, I feel like a lot of people are now having that taken away from them as they start to move back into the workforce. I won't talk about individuals who are making their people work 40 hours in the office before you can work remote and things like that. Those are very drastic measures. But I think that the continuation of that equity distribution continues as we are able to work in ways that make sense to us.
Tammy?
Okay. Yeah, so I've been a remote worker long before the pandemic, and I've worked with different organizations, and the ones that made me feel like I was kind of on an island working on my own obviously was not an environment that allowed me to thrive as much because I didn't feel that empowerment, that buzzword we keep talking about during this question. But then the companies that did invest in me as an employee and allowed me to feel like I was part of the company and its decisions and its movement or in its growth, those were the ones that I did find more empowering and was able to feel like I was part of the company. And I think that that's what every employee wants to feel like, no matter what gender, what sex, whatever. They just want to feel like they're a part of a company that they're investing in it, and the company is investing in them. But on the diversity side, I think the companies that I've seen invest in diversity are the ones that I want to be more involved in, and you just feel that energy of like I want to see this company be a cross section of everyone I touch base with throughout my life, not just work. So I feel like the AV industry has come a long way, but I would love to see more of it by the time I retire. So,
Well, but
If I may quickly
Okay,
jump
good.
in, I just wanted to highlight something that Terrence said. It truly resonated. It touched me. That word trust is the foundation of how you build that empowered workforce. Employers need to trust their employees, and it needs to go both ways. Trust is so important. I love that. I really love that.
So Jen, but from a sociology standpoint, right? There is this thing called proximity bias, right? If I'm in the office and I have a group of 10 reporting to me, and I got 4 direct reports coming to work every day with me, and the other 6 are remote, who am I gonna feel more comfortable? So how does that play into this whole thing when you've got that the potential for proximity bias when you're talking about equity, you're talking about inclusion? Because if I'm going to lunch with these 4 guys or 4 people every day or 3 times a week, but the remote people I see on Zoom or group or whatever, it's just not the same.
You bring up actually a very good example as you're going through that question, and that's, well, I'm going to go to lunch with these folks because they're here in the office and they're with me. But that's a common source of isolation or exclusion because, well, first of all, what if I don't drink? What if I have to go pick up my kids? What if I have anxiety or I have hearing challenges or impairments, mobility impairments, that going to wherever you're going to go, I know it's just going to be absolutely overwhelming and very, very difficult. And, oh, I'm just going to be a bother. I'm just going to go home or not even get the invitation because you're working remotely. And so, like we've talked about, there is bias no matter where, and proximity bias, out of sight, out of mind, can be a very, very scary thing for managers and leaders. So when we are looking at how do I want work to get done, how am I including people, am I doing networking events or happy hours digitally to include everyone, or maybe, we have an event each month where everybody comes into the office or comes to this one exclusive place where, and I mean exclusive as in like get everyone in a room kind of and not leave anybody out. Because there are business decisions that happen over lunch or over these dinners after hours. These are key places of social conversations and corporate conversations.
So we talk about, you guys are all tech people. Technology is great, allows us to do a lot of things, but there's also inherent bias in technology, right? So we talk about DEI as far as people, but what about technology? How does DEI affect what people develop, how the technology is used, and how it impacts society? Frank, you're nodding, so I'm going to go with you first.
I mean, I'm going to kind of tail off what Jen was saying as well, because the conversation that we're trying to build is the narrative of the importance of DEI, and technology bias is equally important. If there's anything that we understood from the hundreds of reports during the pandemic, is that educational opportunities for people who are remote were not equitable. Not everybody had the same opportunity. It depended on your social standing, it depended on your school districts, it depended on the society that you were a part of. So again, I believe technology, once again, can become that unifier in these scenarios, right? As a technology industry, it is on us to build equity into everything that we are doing. And by being equitable means that we are being inclusive, we're being understanding of the people who are using our technology. A lot of times when we have discussions about audiovisual technologies, we kind of revert to the conversation about user experience, right? Who is using your technology? And that answers how to design your system. If you design a system that is more in line with somebody who is between 15 to 20, in that particular age group, and you have a 75-year-old person walking in who is also going to use the same technology, you have created there a non-equitable scenario. So understanding your user base, being conscious of that, and designing technology that matches with the demographic of your user group will help you become more equitable there. Again, bias is going to be there at its core, but technology can be at the forefront of changing it. And at the end of the day, what do we all want, right? We all want to be our authentic self. When we're using something, whether we're being a part of an organization, we're designing a system, it's about being as authentic as you can. And once we're mindful that this is the best that I can get, this is the best that I can do, this is my authentic self, I think we can design a user experience that's equitable and inclusive.
Terrence.
Yeah, I think that the decision making, when it comes to inclusive decision making, I think that it's important that, not only should we see these things that we desire in front of the camera, like diversity in front of the camera or inclusion in front of the camera, but we also have that same decision making on the back side of the camera, behind the camera lens, so that when we have that decision making affecting how we think and how we perceive and how we talk about conversations inclusively, I think that starts to change when you start to see more representation behind the camera lens, per se, when it comes to decision making. And we also, I think, need to see more of that reflected up through the leadership ranks. I kind of talked about this at the beginning of it. As we have higher and higher levels of diversity and inclusion at higher levels of management, executive management within a company, we start to take into consideration, I think, more and more of these potential technology barriers that may affect different types of diversity across the entire spectrum of diversity. And by having more inclusive leadership there to really consider these different ideas and thoughts and ways that people are impacted, then I think we start seeing opportunities to improve our products and services and creating greater accessibility to our products in that way to the marketplace.
If I may on that as well, a quick example, particularly we've been talking a lot about corporate culture and work and whatnot, but also from an R&D perspective, think of like hearing aids and as a technological, of what we're all working in is if I have a hearing aid challenge, impairment, hard of hearing, deaf, that if I walk into a room, can I have the same experience as someone who is hearing? At this point in time, no, not really. Are we close? Sure, there's some great advancement, but that's just one example, whereas there are many other challenges that we can be focusing on. And if our research and development teams, our product development teams have that kind of diversity in that kind of structure, that is just one of many ways that could make a significant impact on the industry.
But this is a point in the conversation where DEI starts to affect the bottom line, right? There is a bottom line. There still is a budget. When these decisions are being made, how often do you think those budget decisions take precedence over this inclusivity that we're talking about, this equity that we're talking about?
From a budgetary standpoint, let's talk about that. So Frank, I'm sorry, maybe it was Jen that was talking about, as people get together and like we were talking about the proximity bias piece of it, and going out to lunch with your coworkers who are there on site. Let's talk about getting people together frequently to have and to create this inclusion effort of getting people together so that they can feel a sense of belonging and being a part, not only with those who are on site but off site. But then what ends up happening is we hear, oh, it's a budget constraint. It's a budget constraint. We can't get people together because we have to look at cost. I think that this active stance of inclusiveness requires an investment. It requires an investment to create this culture. You have to be able to invest in it. I mean, it's kind of like going from a part-time commitment to a full-time engagement. I mean, it really requires us to consider that's a part of doing business. It's a standard. It should become a new status quo. When we look at how we build that in. But I think it's challenging because I think there's a lot of organizations that feel like they don't need to spend that additional money. They don't understand what's wrong with the way we're doing it now. And that's where we're at in this transformative sea change that's happening within the tech industry. Is you have a lot of companies that are still trying to find or come to grips with the understanding that, oh, this is going to cost money. This is going to cause. It's going to take skin in the game on our part to create this transformation. This isn't just something we can just do on a part-time basis.
So you talk about skin in the game. So, let's face it, tech industry is a pretty white male-dominated industry. That's why we're up here talking about this. If I'm a white male who's in senior management, I'm going, what the am I going to do with this? Right? So, Tammy, how do you change that perspective of the fear that some males have about making this happen?
I was going to tease, what? This is a male-dominated industry? I didn't know. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I think they have to make that change. I mean, to some of Terrence's points, finding that budget, it's not about finding it. You have to have it to make these employees feel welcome. And if those male executives or any level of a company that doesn't see that, then they're definitely outdated in their thinking process. I think it's important for them. I just feel like it's a part of education. If they're not educated to know more about diversity, then they need to get up to speed, because that is exactly what's coming into this industry is more people that are looking for more diverse companies to work with. I think it's all about education, and on both sides, not just the male side, but like on my side, I learned to be educated on saying, that kind of behavior or this kind of thinking doesn't work for me at this company. So if that's the way that you're going to continue on those paths, then maybe this isn't the company for me to be working for. And if that's the case, you're going to be losing employees because you have this dated mentality of thinking. So I just think it's about educating people on what you should be looking out for in diversity, and on the flip side, how you're being treated at a company. So
Frank, you're nodding.
Yes, I'm nodding. I'm nodding because there is a business case to DEI initiatives. Now, in my role as the chair of the Diversity Council at VIXA, do I wish that there was diversity and we were inclusive and we've just built this beautiful AV industry? Yes, but at the same time, the demographic, the people that you're talking about in leadership also need to be convinced, because yes, money matters. There needs to be skin in the game. Now, we've already touched on two very important things that can equate to their understanding. So R&D, Jen spoke about R&D. When you design a product, diversity is critical there. It's a very good example. If you are designing a product for someone and they are not represented at every stage of the R&D process of that product, it is highly likely that that product will fail. HR and recruitment. If you're trying to recruit and get a more diverse talent pool and you have not heard their concerns, you will lose that talent pool. And all of that equates to money. Now, we talk about inclusion, and a lot of times our conversations do veer towards, sex and race and issues like that. It's also about being inclusive of that generation of people who have not been exposed to these challenges. Of somebody who's been in leadership for 30 years ago, and it's a common thing that I've heard a lot, we never had this 30 years ago. It's true. You had it 30 years ago. You just chose to ignore it. But today, society has asked you to please look into this. Instead of being combative, we can also be inclusive of those individuals through what Tammy said, education. Education is where we tell them that there is a reason why this would build a better corporation, a better organization, and in turn, a better society. So without a doubt, there is absolutely a business case to diversity initiatives. There's tons of research. There are consultants out there. If your organization feels the need to step in that direction, you can always get the help you need to build that path. There are lots of experts on this today.
Well,
But go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to make the point. We were talking about bottom line here. You're either going to spend the money on diversity programs, or you're going to lose workforce. Which would you rather do? I think I would rather bring in a great workforce, have a great diversity program, and that'll allow that employee to stay. But if you keep turning over people, that's where you're going to lose your bottom line then.
So this is about creating allies, right? You need allies to make this happen.
Yes.
So Jen, from a sociology standpoint, dealing with all this diversity, how do you then create allies within that power, that corporate power structure, which tends to be dominated by white males? How do you create allies? How do you, I wouldn't say flip them, convert them, but how do you create those allies?
So I think there's a lot of fear that happens as well. And when we're talking about this old white man problem, it's true. We've been having conversations around diversity, maybe with different language. Not that long ago, you're looking just within the white community, you have different cultures like Italian and Irish. How are they perceived in this country as immigrants coming in? They're both white, and they both face significant impacts in hiring processes and in just social integration. And so it's not just us versus them problem. It's that what are we all each facing, and what can we do together? Social. So I'm not going to give a whole lecture because I could totally talk about sociology for ages. But even within sociology as a social science, there are there's three different camps. But in what we can take away from this today is that there is a theory called functionalism. The idea that our social cultural behaviors are meant to be impactful, stay steady and traditional and not move, because that is what gives society that base. There are a lot of people that fall into that functionalist belief when we're talking about DEI, and that's okay. As long as you're respectful of, and as you're going through these interviewing, hiring, are you a right fit? Because I'm a social interactionist. I believe that, and this is a classical social theory as well, is that these micro moments, every time deviance and a norm are challenged, that will set the basis and define the cultural moving forward. That's how social change happens. And so we have to look very closely at what is important to us, what are we really trying to accomplish, and where do we want to make these shifts.
I want to comment real quick too about the social aspect of this. The tech industry looks at this from a professional standpoint, but from a societal standpoint as well. We have such large amounts of influence there that's crossing over into the professional space as well. So when this issue becomes highly politicized, and we have some who are calling this woke politics, and they're referred to as woke politics and DEI and critical race theory and some of these other areas of education and enlightenment that we really need to kind of look to and listen to, when we have folks who are continuing to, on a societal basis, shove that to the side as if it's not worth listening to. It's a bunch of people making noise and things like that. I think a lot of that bleeds over into our workspaces. It bleeds over into how we live and work professionally. And so, even though we can have the best intentions up here on the stage too, there's also a lot of work going beyond just here, this stage. It's out within our society as well that helps shape and force the trajectory of the success of a lot of these type of programs at companies.
Yeah, so what I was going to say was, by wanting to have that change, by having groups like the Women's Council and the Diversity Council, so that we can get out messages to other people about, there needs to be diversity in the AV industry. When I have had male executives that I worked with, and if I wanted to see change, I talked about that change, or I would invite them to a meeting and say, come and see what we're all about. If you want to learn more about what women are looking for in the industry, what initiatives we're working on, then the best way to find that out is by going to a council meeting or just talking to me. I think that's where the change starts. And if they're not coming to you, you go to them and say, these are the things that I'd like to see happen in this company so that we can find more diverse talent or make the company more diverse.
At least to my next question is, someone who's watching this, great conversation. They've heard a lot. They've heard empowerment. They've heard trust. They've heard, the need for equity, right? But it's a lot, throwing a lot at them, right? And society, to Terrence's point, is throwing a lot at them. What concrete steps, or what first steps do you think people need to take when they start this DEI journey? I want all four of you to answer. Whoever wants to start can start.
I'll start.
Okay.
I think from a behavior standpoint, it really starts with developing the right habits, and that habit is an active habit. We can't be complacent in expecting change to happen, and we can't expect somebody else to have our good intentions and to do things for us. We have to when you see an inequitable situation happening, when you see an injustice type situation happening, you have to take an active stand and an active voice to voice that concern, to share those concerns, share it with your manager, share it with your leadership, share it with your friends, family, whatnot. But it takes an active part on us to start having those conversations, to initiate that conversation. Because if you don't, and you expect somebody else to just kind of facilitate that change, then no one's going to facilitate the change, right? So it just takes an active role on our parts to really engage, and everyone in the audience as well, to really, when you see it, vocalize it and can share your concerns about it when you see it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree as far as if you want to see change, you have to be the change you want to affect. So, it's maybe simply first doing some research, and then find organizations that align with what you want to see. That's part of the reason why I got involved in the Women's Council 6 years ago, is because I wanted to see change, and I didn't know how to do that on my own. So I started networking with people that saw that vision and change as well. I think it starts simply by doing a little research, or asking people that are in the industry that where do you go to find maybe different organizations that align with what you want to see and change. So
I'm the ultimate optimist all the time, and I would like to believe that there are far more things and commonalities between us than there are things that divide us. So it's about finding that commonalities. People in the tech industry are uniquely poised already in that we are already common with tech. We have an inclination towards tech. Use that, build on that, and find your own diversity journey. It's about being comfortable in yourself. It's about being authentic to yourself and saying, this is who I am. And then you reach out and find those resources. There are lots of people out there ready to support this at an individual level, at an organizational level, councils like the Diversity Council and the Women's Council. There are lots of groups out there that are there to advocate for you and give you the empowerment that you need. Be authentic to yourself and believe that everyone's diversity journey is truly unique.
I will leave you with a tidbit that you're not going to find at any other diversity panel, and that is, look at cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT is a therapy that is helpful for people with anxiety and depression, and it can be really, really useful in environments like this where we have inherent biases and where we have to really challenge, why do I really think that way? So take, for example, professionalism, right? Say, for example, that you're interviewing a young woman who is transgender. She is presenting as a woman. She has very, very conservative, long skirt, blouse, looks the part, incredibly professional. But she's transgender. So am I looking that as, well, that's not professional because she's not wearing male appropriate attire? But if she was bisex female, she would be top-notch, hire her in a minute by appearances alone. So how can we get to that bottom of that with CBT is, well, why do I think that way? What does professional really look like? And by taking a moment to look at from the other perspective, those, and again, it's small moments that are the biggest impact for change.
Well, guys, this has been a fantastic conversation. I hope everybody who watched took a lot from this. There is a lot to DEI, and we hope that you guys, as they said, take the challenge and move forward. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.